Before my freshman year at Faulkner started, our soccer coach wanted to meet with all of the players and the parents of the players to basically spell out his expectations for the soccer program. And so as he was meeting in this room with all the players and the parents, he first started out by, of course, saying what you expect him to say at a Christian university. The very first thing that comes first for our program is God. We will emphasize God with every part, and we want God to come first in every single thing. And then you can probably know what he's going to say next. Second is academics. In fact, I have a few standards for our soccer players that when it comes to the classroom, and it's as follows. I want every single one of my players to show up to every single class 15 minutes early. And on the very first day, at the very beginning of every semester, I want you to walk up to that teacher and I want you to shake the teacher's hand and I want you to introduce yourself and to thank the teacher for teaching the class. And then after you shake her hand or his hand, I want you to sit in one of the first two rows. And I want you to give eye contact. I want you to take really good notes. And then whenever class is over, once everybody leaves, I then want you to thank the teacher for teaching your class. And then I want you to leave. Now, I never really asked my parents what they thought of that when they were in the room, but I have a feeling they thought, well, it can't hurt, Andrew. And so I did exactly what the soccer coach said to do. I showed up 15 minutes early to every single class. And at the very beginning of the year, I introduced myself and thanked the teacher for teaching the class. And I ended up at the very end of that class staying later than everybody else and thanking the teacher for teaching. I showed up early, I stayed long, I shook hands, and I thanked the teacher. Some might say I was probably there more than anybody else, but I have to tell you it was definitely not reflected in my freshman year GPA. It's because it turns out that you can actually show up early, you can stay late, you can shake hands, you can smile at people, and you can be somewhere more than anybody else. But if you don't want to actually do well, you won't. And isn't that really true with life in the church? That we can show up early, we can stay late, we can shake hands, we can thank people. But as we're going to look at tonight, if you really don't want to be made well, you won't. And it's not really that we don't like the idea of well. It's not that we don't like the idea of change, and it's not that we don't like the idea of new. We all love that. But I think what happens is we love maybe more the idea of God changing our circumstances more than actually God changing us. And as we're going to look at tonight, part of the reason is because sometimes the change that we might need is not necessarily the change that we want. And one of the reasons why that's hard is that God, when it comes to change, he sometimes disrupts what's normal. And what I mean by that is that in our aspirations for new things and new beginnings and change, that sometimes in order for God to bring about something new, he has to disrupt what is normal. Like it might be normal for you to let your alarm go off, you hit it, you go and brush your teeth, you drink some coffee or whatever you do, you get dressed, you go to school or you go to work, but you want something new really bad. So maybe what God actually needs to do is for you to get up 30 minutes earlier, spend some time in prayer, spend some time in worship, spend some time in his word. Because again, in order for God to bring about something new, sometimes he has to disrupt what's normal. And maybe for some of you, it's normal for you to hang out with a certain group of people. But you've seen where normal has actually gotten you. And so because you don't like where it's taking you, you then have to change maybe the group that you're around. Because again, in order for God to bring about something new, sometimes he has to disrupt something that's normal. And then again, maybe for some of you, it's not normal for you to walk to your neighbor and introduce yourself and to do a random act of kindness, to begin in a ministry that you've never done or even attempted before. But like you really want something new for your life. But again, in order for God to do something new, sometimes he has to disrupt what is normal. And what was familiar and what was normal for this man in John chapter 5 was about to be disrupted. But like we experience with any kind of disruption, that sometimes the disruption that we're going through is actually, once we get on the other side, the very thing that we actually needed the most. And so I want you to turn with me to John chapter 5, and we're going to begin here in verse 1, and this is what it says. It says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool. In Aramaic it's called Bethesda. Now if you notice in the very first part of this verse, it says that Jesus was going to a feast of the Jews. There was a lot of feast of the Jews. We don't know exactly which feast this was, but here's what we do know. It was something very important that Jesus was going to. He was going to this very important tradition that was very much so a monument for the Jewish people. He was going to something that was very good. But one of the things that I love about Jesus is so many of the times when he's going on his way to do something really good, when he sees the need to stop and maybe do something better, he stops. Like y'all remember the time when Jesus was called to go to Jairus' house to heal Jairus' daughter? Then on that way, that woman that had the issue of blood touched the hem of his garment. And when the crowd gasped and backed up, Jesus then stopped. And then Jairus' daughter, they run and say, hey, he's dead. Or she's dead. And Jesus is like, no, she's not dead. She's just asleep. They're like, no, Jesus, dead and asleep are two different things. Yeah, to you they are, but to me they're not. That I can be here and then I can be there. I have enough of me to go around wherever you need it. And so what you notice about Jesus' ministry, whether it's in John 4, he stops and meets this woman at a well, that Jesus is giving us a lesson I think we can all learn, and that is to be more spirit-led than we are schedule-driven. Because we try to get a lot packed into our schedules, and we run through life, and we think God's running with us. He's not. In fact, two of the greatest compliments that were ever given to people in the Bible was that they actually walked with God. And so Jesus stops here in Jerusalem. The very place that other people were avoiding was the very place that Jesus walked into. It says now, when he was there, he went by this sheep gate. There was this pool that was called Bethesda. And this pool was very historic for that group of people. An ancient tradition said that this pool had within it healing powers. And what they believed was that every so often they would sit around that pool and there would be these bubbles that would come to the surface. And the bubbles that would come to the surface, it was believed in ancient tradition said that an angel's wing would come down, stir that water, and when the bubbles came to the top, people would then jump in and get their healing. And so because, keep in mind, this is well before the days where, like, if you showed up at a hospital today, it doesn't matter what kind of money you have, you are getting service. This was not like this then. And so this was the only means, this was the only hope for people that didn't have an income, that had nobody to help them, that they would go and sit around this pool waiting and hoping for the bubbles to come to the top of the surface. Now, what was really happening with the bubbles was that there was this hidden reservoir of water, kind of like a spring, that was in the hill part of that country. And whenever that spring was released, it would then bring water in, and that's where the bubbles were coming from. And we sit here and we hear this story and we're like, well, why in the world would you believe something like that? But yet, when we've all gone through something hard, we're looking for anything, right? We're all looking for hope. We're all looking for something. And for a group of people that didn't experience what a lot of other people were experiencing, they were clinging to some kind of hope. And even the name Bethesda says it all. Bethesda actually means a house of mercy. Please do not mistake this place for like being a country club. This is a hospital for very, very broken people. And so can you imagine as you're sitting there with, as we're going to read in a second, multitudes, which some believe that it could be thousands of people that are sitting in a very tight spot, waiting for bubbles to come to the surface. Can you imagine the tense feeling in the air, the competition to see who's going to be the first person to get in? Because there's only enough for one person to get their bubbles. Can you imagine the competition to get in that pool? Have you ever been to a water park? And if you haven't, I'll basically sum it up for you in a few seconds. It's 120 degrees outside, and you're standing in line for 45 minutes for a ride that lasts like 5 seconds. And what they give you whenever you go to water parks is this little tube that you're to carry around the whole day. And basically, your entire day just looks like this. And while you're waiting in line after line, they purposefully put in every single line no shade because they want you to buy their $8 lemonade. And so you wait. And while you're waiting in this very long line, you see other people going in and getting their bubbles, and you desperately want to fall in something refreshing. So before we moved to Madison, Cruz and Cam had seen this sign for this water park, and they had been begging us, please, before we leave, can we go to the water park? Can we go to the water park? We said, yeah, we'll go. So we took them to that water park, and we were carrying around our floats and theirs. And while we were walking around this water park, we get in one of those really long lines. And while we're standing in line getting ready to go down this slide that lasts about 5 seconds, we hear way down about 2 sections down, this person that's getting in the line saying, hey, excuse me, I need to go up there and get with my family, you know? And we don't know if that was true or not. We're not quite sure, but we're not here to judge. He very well might be trying to get with his family, but you know not everybody was thinking the way I was. And I don't know if y'all have noticed this, but when anybody cuts in line, there's 3 different people in the world. There's the person that will literally say nothing. They're like, hey, whatever. Hey, that's up to you. That's between you and the Lord. You go ahead. There's the people that feel like they're doing something, but all they really do is just mumble under their breath, like, you know, this is an injustice. But they won't say anything out loud. But then there are the people that will actually say something. Well, the guy that was literally standing right in front of our family in line was the guy that likes to say something. And so as he's going through, excuse me, I need to get my family, this really massive man was like, excuse me, sir, are you lost? And I was like, oh, this is not going to go well. And then he yells something back at the guy that was in front of me, and they start yelling back and forth all these different word combinations. And while that's happening, I then put my hands over my son's ears and eyes, and I turn his head. And part of the reason why I'm turning him and me is people start getting their phones out and they're videoing it. And I'm like, great, there's going to be like, there's a preacher at Robert's on this viral YouTube video where a fight breaks out on a water slide line. And it's all because this group of people are waiting to fall into something refreshing. This pool that's Bethesda is not some pool that's just wee splash. This is a pool that has healing powers. In their mind, can you imagine the kind of competition that's in that air? Can you imagine how tense that pool really was? Have you ever been on the edge of what you might classify as like a breakthrough? Like where you're really close to something changing. And you see change and opportunity within your grasp, but then you see other people get their bubbles. Like you worked really, really hard, actually harder than some of the other people, but they get the acknowledgement at school and you don't. We splash. Or maybe for some of you, you've been working your first job so incredibly hard and somebody else gets the promotion and you don't. We splash. Or maybe for some of you, you see someone else get engaged. And that's something you have so desperately wanted. And you even comment on Facebook, I'm so happy for you. But inside, it's hard. And so you see them getting the very thing that you want. And what can happen is exactly what happens with this guy. When you experience disappointment after disappointment, that disappointment can kind of start to deteriorate the determination that you brought into the pool. And so it goes on to say that there was multitudes of people there, blind, lame, and paralyzed. But the Bible says there was one man. This man had been invalid for 38 years. It says there's a multitude of people, but Jesus walks up to this one guy. Why does he walk up to one? Because couldn't Jesus just stand on the highest point around the sheep gate and say, all right, I'm here. Who wants to be made well? I'm going to make this happen for everybody. But he finds this one guy. I don't know. This is just conjecture. But maybe part of the reason of what he's trying to tell us is this, that yes, I'm big enough for everyone, but I'm not too big for just one. And what I mean by that is, right now, we think about some of the things that are happening in our world, and we're like, man, I know God is all powerful, but like what I'm going through compared to what's going on in Ukraine, and I know that God sees me, but in comparison to what's going on with people on the other side of the world that don't have clean drinking water, and I know that he knows about me, but at the same time, I hear about the orphan crisis in the United States, and I'm dealing with what people call maybe a first world problem. We think that maybe God doesn't have enough to go around. But what he's saying, yes, I'm big enough to deal with the big stuff in Ukraine and Africa and here in the United States, but I'm still not too big to see you. And so he walks up to this one man. And what I know about this guy is this, is there was one time in his life that this man had faith. And the reason why I know that is because he shows up at the pool. The whole reason why you're at the pool is because maybe mom and dad brought him 38 years ago. Maybe his friend Fred brought him 38 years ago. He sat him there by that pool. He rolled out his mat. Week 1 happened, and he's laying there with hope. Week 10 happened, and he's still sitting there with hope. Week 1 happened, and he was sitting there with hope. Then week, 16 and on, and then year 1, then year 2. Then when year 3 rolls around, he starts losing that hope. Then year 5, he gets a little bit more miserable. Year 10, he gets a little frustrated. Then about year 20, year 30, year 38, you just don't believe it's going to happen. And so he's sitting there. Keep in mind, if you're looking geographically where he's at, this is so important. Where the sheep gate was within earshot and eyeshot of the temple. So as he's laying there for 38 years, he's seeing all of these other people experiencing the very thing that he thought he was going to experience at this point in his life. Like he's seeing families walk to the temple for worship, and he's reminded of what he doesn't have. We splash, right? And he sees a dad and a son maybe throwing the ball. We splash. And he sees a husband and a wife walking together. We splash. And he hears a bunch of people praising God and doing the very thing he wants to do, but he doesn't get to do. But he sees it and he hears it. We splash. It can start to deteriorate that determination. And it kind of made me think of this. You might have seen this picture before. This is a view from Alcatraz. And Alcatraz, of course, housed for many years the world's most well-known and United States' most well-known felons and murderers. And if you do some digging in history about it, one of the things that you find out is that there was actually, turns out years later, some of the people that were actually housed on that island and were not going to be able to leave were innocent. But whether they were innocent or whether they were not, can you imagine, though, having to stand on this island and you see off in the distance the lights of the big city? You see people walking up and down those streets while you're confined. You hear people cheering at football games and you're locked inside. and you hear and see people walking to plays and fireworks going off and hear people celebrating, and you're stuck on this island. A while, you kind of start to wonder, is anything really going to change? See, because here's what we know. This guy went to this well at one time with faith. Response to Jesus, you start to get the picture that his sickness didn't really have a lot to do with his body anymore, but it started to have to do with his heart. And I think there's a lesson there that you and I can all be very outwardly mobile, but you can be inwardly dead. I mean, you can have like the best house on the best street with a picket fence around it, but be inwardly dead. And so this guy has been seeing all of these things, and up walks Jesus. Jesus saw him laying there, and he knew that he had been there a long time. And he stands over the man and says, "Sir, do you want to get well?" Now, notice what Jesus doesn't say. He doesn't say, "Do you want to get better?" Because that's not what Jesus came to do, is just to make people better. He doesn't improve our lives, he perfects them. He doesn't enhance them, he completes them. That's why he says, "Do you want to be made well?" And when you hear this question for Jesus, it sounds kind of odd. You're like, well, Jesus, of course the guy wants to be well. He's at the pool that's with the ultimate goal of trying to make people well. And the reason why I say that is not everybody wants to be made well because of what that requires of them. So I want you to think about it like this. There was a Johns Hopkins study that was done many years ago, and it was called Change or Die. I'm pretty sure that's what it was called. And this doctor from Johns Hopkins was noticing how he kept telling all of his patients that if they would just change certain things about their living and their diet, they would live. But he kept seeing all of his patients dying. And so what he asked them to do is if they could be a part of this study. And so they were a part of this study. He ended up looking at their bodies of all these patients he had, that he told them, if you will change, you will live. If you won't change, you will die. After studying the bodies of those people, he found 9 out of the 10 of them made no changes. That's why I want to ask you, do you really want to be made well? And I know that sounds odd, but a lot of people don't. And again, I think part of it is because it is easier sometimes to stay sick than to actually get well, because of what getting well would require of me. And so then notice what this man says to Jesus. He says, "Well, sir, I have nobody to put me in the pool, and then when the water is stirred up, other people actually go down before me." And I love the fact that we're going to notice in just a second when the man lays out his reasons why he can't, Jesus does not even address them. But I also think within this, there's a few lessons about change that I want to give you a heads up on. And this doesn't stop like when you get to college or become an adult. I think in some ways it increases. I want to give you a heads up about change, and it's this. Every single time you try to change, something, I promise, is going to get in the way. There will. Satan will put in front of you a million different reasons why you need to quit on the thing that you know that matters the most. He will. But you need just one reason to take that step to get better. And it's Jesus. In fact, I was just trying to think of a few of the things that I've heard, and maybe you've heard these too, that some will say, well, Andrew, we want to change, we want to do better, but right now it's just not a good time. Like when things start to slow down, especially with COVID, right? When things start to get better with COVID, then we will get... Or, when Johnny's done with his travel ball tournament, then we'll get... We're always waiting for a more convenient season. And you're like, well, maybe for me it's not a convenient season. Maybe I'm waiting someone to compel me and to help me. You have that. You're like, well, no, I don't have anybody to help me get in the pool. Well, now you do, and his name's Jesus. He's the answer for the ache you have inside of you. There's someone to help you get in. Or maybe for some of you, you're waiting for like a particular feeling to fire off in your heart, in your mind. Then you're going to make that move. Now, I want you to know God did give you your feelings. And I will go ahead and say, I do think part of the reason why we might have some of the problems we do is we have detached emotion from everything at times if we're not careful. But there is also the balance of being emotionless and being emotion-led. And I think about it like with feelings. Feelings are good and all, but they're kind of like waves. They come and go. You have good ones, you have bad ones. And the amazing thing about God is that you don't always have to have feelings in order for God to show up. In fact, I can remember so many times, I know this sounds odd for a preacher to say, but it's true, and other ministers and other Christians probably feel the same way, but I have woken up on Sunday mornings when it's my Sunday to preach, and I don't feel like it. Because I'll think, well, how am I supposed to preach on this when I'm terrible at that? I don't feel like it. And when I know what I'm going through in here and I'm supposed to talk about something out there, but then I walk through the doors, I get a hug from a sweet old lady, a kiss on the cheek from a sweet old lady. I shake the hands with somebody shows attention to my kids. I get to worship with other believers. God gets me in the mood. And it's amazing to see how we think, well, I'm just waiting for something else. We are probably thinking, well, maybe I'm just stuck in something. No, you've stopped. There's always going to be a reason why we don't need to do what God wants us to do. And that's a heads up you have to know about change. But the second thing is this, that kind of like this guy's experiencing, that you can surround yourself with people that will validate you instead of people that will challenge you. Like if you're looking for people that will tell you to stay comfortable, they're out there. It doesn't really take much looking. In fact, there was one commentary I read that said that this pool actually represented their comfort zones. This represented to them familiarity. But one of the things that we talked about at the very beginning, right, is that the journey of faith moves you from what was maybe familiar to what is unfamiliar. And in order for God to bring about something new, sometimes he has to disrupt that normal. I read in a book this past week that the greatest enemy of faith is sometimes familiar. That you can be around the same people that just validate what's broken about you, and you lay in your brokenness for 5, 10, 20, 38 years. But another heads up is this man believes something that I think we believe, and it's this, that we're in competition with other people. That it's me versus somebody. That we're not in competition with each other. And I think that's one of the greatest things that the enemy tries to do to distract us from what's the most important thing. I love this example, and maybe y'all remember this from the Paralympic Games. I don't remember how many years ago it was, but several years ago. This is a picture of David Brown. He's in the blue, and in the orange there is Jerome Avery. The guy in the orange, Jerome Avery, was one of the fastest men in the entire world. And Jerome was getting ready to try to make the Olympic Games. He went to the trials to try to qualify, and everybody was talking about Jerome. He's going to break the records. He's going to win a gold medal. And so Jerome had been training. He gets to the starting line. If you remember the videos of, he kind of has a stumble, and other people go ahead of him, and all the work, all the effort, all the things about this guy did not happen. And so that year, he watches the Olympics from his house. He sees other people getting their bubbles. He sees other people getting what he wanted, and he's at home. But you know what I love about Jerome? Is he didn't take the attitude that I'm in competition with other people really per se. He didn't sit and wallow in what he experienced. He said, you know what I'm going to do? Because I can't do that doesn't mean I can't do anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be a guided runner for the Paralympic Games. I'm going to help someone else try to win their bubbles. And so we found this guy named David Brown that had a lot of promise, super fast guy. And they trained together. They ended up signing together. And so Jerome Avery and David Brown practiced and practiced. And as you can tell in the picture for the Paralympic Games, since David Brown is blind, they would have a string that would go from one of his hands to the other hand, and they would run in unison together. Well, the day of the Paralympic Games finally happened, the gun fired, and they shot off from that line. And whenever they shot off that line, the very first people through that line and won gold was David Brown and Jerome Avery. But it's interesting, the gold medal really went to David Brown. Jerome Avery was just there to help him. And one of my favorite things, and I tried to find a picture of it, but there's a video out there of Jerome Avery standing behind David, and David doesn't even know that he's doing this. He's pointing at him and getting the crowd to get fired up for somebody else. But I did find this picture that I absolutely love, that after they crossed that finish line, this picture of celebration together. See, Jerome understood something that we all have to understand, and it's this, that he said, you know, when David wins, I win. And when I win, David wins. We're not in competition with each other. When you win, I win, and when I win, you win. In fact, one of the quickest ways to kill any kind of contentment you have had in your heart is comparison. To see where other people are and where you're not. And so Jesus, as he's standing over this man, and he says, listen, I don't have anybody to help me get in. Jesus then tells him, well, here's what I want you to do. I want you to get up, take up your bed, and I want you to walk. Again, Jesus doesn't even address the man's excuses. And it says this, at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed, and he walked. Now, that day was the Sabbath, so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, it's the Sabbath. It's not lawful for you to take up your bed. Hold on a second. So you're telling me, since you've been going to the temple for a really long time, religious leader, that you have seen this man for 38 years, and he's obviously not able to walk. And the only thing you take away from this entire encounter is that he is stepping on your tradition. And you have missed the miracle of what Jesus has just done. You're like, well, no, Andrew, actually, it's not a tradition. It says in the text, it's not lawful. No, they said that. Jesus did not say that. See, there's a difference in the oral Torah and the written Torah. The oral Torah was tradition, and the written Torah was law. It was only in the oral Torah that said you couldn't do this. So you see what happened here? Their tradition stood in the way of them seeing Jesus do something amazing. Traditions, they are great. They serve their purpose. There's so many good ones that we have that we need to keep. But at the end of the day, we always have to remember traditions are just that. They are traditions. And they should never, ever, ever stand in the way of anybody seeing Jesus Christ. And now also notice here in this text that Jesus tells the man to take up his bed and to walk with it. And it was kind of odd to me because I was thinking, well, the man doesn't need the mat anymore because he can walk. Why not leave it there for somebody else? Why are you carrying that? And my theory is that mat represented his story of what Jesus Christ had done. Because he's going to walk in public and people are going to recognize the man that had been laying there for 38 years. Like, wait, what happened? I mean, because I know you, but I see that you're carrying the mat. Well, let me tell you about my mat. And so you see what Jesus is doing here. He's trying to address this broken system that was happening during this day that did not allow guys like this to carry their story, to carry their mat. Here's the thing. Every single person in this room has a mat. They have a story of what God has done in their life. Every person. And you may not need that mat, but I promise you somebody else out there does need it. So tell it. Impart it with the next generation and entrust what God is going to do with it. I'm talking the hard parts and the beautiful parts. Some of your stories are really great. Some of them are really hard. Some of them are beautiful and hard at the same time. But you remember in the book of Joshua, right when the people were getting ready to cross over that Jordan, that the people went through, they're about to be in the promised land. The priest went through last. And one of the things God told the people to do is to take 12 stones from that river and to stack those stones on top of each other. And the reason why you're going to stack these stones up is there's going to come a time where your kids are struggling in their faith. And when they do, what I want you to do is I want you to take them back to those stones. And what I want you to do is I want you to tell them over and over again about what God did here. And here's what you notice. They told the story, good parts and bad. You're like, well, what bad was there? Well, look in Judges 4:21. It says the people were running through the river. Even though God was doing something, they were still a little scared. Mom and dad struggled. And he said, I want you, whenever they see these stones, to talk about what God had done and impart that to the next generation. And guess what? They did for a while. And the reason why I know that, their worship was strong. There was no false gods. Their faith was just very bold. And I don't know where it happened, but somewhere between Joshua 4 and Judges 2, they stopped carrying that mat. And the reason why I know that, Judges 2:10 says there grew up a generation that did not know the Lord or the things that he had done for Israel. I want to encourage you to let you know, whether you're young or old alike, you all have a story. Something that God has done. And maybe you are tempted to put that down. But what I want you to understand is that while you may not need that mat, somebody out there does. So like we started, I want to ask you that same question. Do you want to get well? Not better, not to improve things, not to enhance things, but do you want to be made well? Maybe you're here tonight and you haven't made the decision to put on Christ in baptism. Again, he's not wanting to just enhance your life a little bit. He's wanting to complete it, to make it whole. Maybe for some of you that you've just stopped telling your story. Maybe for some of you, as you look at this encounter, you've started to realize, my sickness has nothing really to do with me physically, but more me spiritually. And I've been laying in this for so long. What I love about this guy, that when they told him to put down his mat, he was like, I don't care what you really say, because I've been laying in that mat for 38 years. I'm not about to lay back in what I was laying in before. That God is giving you that opportunity, and I beg you to please, please take him up on that opportunity tonight while we stand and we sing this song together.